My journey into this industry really began when I was with a partner with an ad agency and asked if we would be willing to do some brand work for them. And I thought, well, that sounds pretty interesting. And of course, my whole creative team thought, well, gosh, we get to do a cannabis company? Absolutely. And this was the very early days of medical marijuana in Colorado. So there weren't a ton of brands or visibility for companies in Colorado, but we thought this was a great opportunity. And so what struck me is we did some consumer research. We did intercepts, which are what you will do when you talk directly to consumers and ask questions about the products. And we had folks who were stationed outside of a few dispensaries and would ask these consumers, why are you using the product? What's your background? Where do you come from? And what struck me was just the variety of people that we saw coming through in these surveys in terms of their age, their gender, their ethnicity, the reasons for using cannabis. And that's when it struck me that it was not just about getting high, which is pretty much what my experience was with the product was. And I really began to take an interest in what was going on. So I kept in touch with this company that ultimately was Dixie Brands over the next several years. And the very first week of legalization, 2014, is when I joined the company. Now, at the time, there weren't a lot of guys coming out of traditional sort of corporate backgrounds. I was a partner with an ad agency. We had big, conservative clients and pretty standard marketing background. And so I actually went to my family prior to taking this job, and I had three children who were at the time ages 13, 11, and 5 or 6. And I had a conversation with them and I said, this is the job I'm thinking about taking. And I want to make sure you guys are aware of that. And all three of them were in tears. The littlest one, just because the other two were in tears, but they were all in tears and didn't want me to take the job. And luckily I did not listen to employment advice from my 13-year-old son. And I did ultimately take the job. But the idea is that, at that time, it was a really big jump. And it was really something that I had to make sure I both supported and was comfortable with doing. But it was knowing what I knew about how people were using this plant and the potential that the plant had that really emboldened me to say, you know what, this is the right thing to do, whether or not legalization continues to move forward. And, again, Colorado was the first state in the country to be legal. So at the time, I didn't have the vision to know that we'd be at however many, 30 plus states now. But I knew that the plant had power, and I knew that I was seeing people who were using this product in a way that was really unique to cannabis. So I felt good about what I was doing and ultimately made that move. January 2014, the start of the legal industry. It was absolute chaos. No one had any idea as to the number of units that would be sold, or all of the packaging regulations were new. For any of these states that have come on board recently that go through the regulatory process and launch live into a market, they've learned so much from prior states like Colorado, where we just kind of jumped into it. And we had regulations, of course, and I was very proud of what we did, but actually launching a legal market was something that I was so privileged to be part of and to see take place. And marketing really became an important part of that. So one of the very first things that we did at Dixie was we had the opportunity to redo all of our packaging, because we were moving into a regulatory environment that required different packaging than we had previously. And I believe very strongly that with consumers walking into a store having no idea what products were on the shelves, or for that matter, even what products were available beyond flower, we had to figure out a way to create what I would call a contract with the consumer. And that contract was, I got to believe if they've got really good packaging and if it looks professional and well done, they probably have a good product, right? That was my thinking was, if I can express that to the consumer, we have a better chance of being the product they choose to take off the shelf. And I think that did hold to be true, because at the time, the bar was set pretty low. Companies like Wana were doing a good job, but there were many others that were still kind of in the realm of in-house printed labels on, kind of kludgy packaging. And the availability of child-resistant packaging was just at its nascent stages at that point. So the options were pretty limited. We came forward with products that really had a different look and feel and looked professional on the shelf. And that was, I think, the first right move that we did at that time. Now, the problem is that we got those products on the shelf, but early on we didn't know what the demand would be, and we actually ran out of product. And so supply chain became a really big part of my focus as a marketer, actually, because I knew that if I couldn't launch a product into the market in a way that I was confident that we'd have enough supply to meet the demand, I was going to shoot myself in the foot. And if you look historically now at some of the data through companies like BDSA, you can see, interestingly, because I have this perspective being in Wana currently, you can see where Wana and Dixie kind of started out the same from a market share standpoint, and then Wana began to rise. And then there's this precipitous decline for Dixie. Well, that was right about when we ran out of product and couldn't get on the shelves. And then Wana continued to keep going up. And then Dixie started to come back a little bit. And then we'd have another dip and Wana would continue to go up. And that gap began to grow. And as a marketer, while my ultimate goal is to connect with the consumer and to sell products and get them into their hands, I do have to look at the market trends and my ability to be able to fulfill on the products that we are developing and creating in the company. Big pieces of that first year were spent heavily focused on destigmatization, because what we see as the cannabis industry now, particularly for those who live in Western states, is not what it was in 2014. We were still battling everything from people will overdose on cannabis to it's going to get into the hands of kids to we had actually a few issues early on in the early days of legalization in Colorado that really were actually significant issues. So one of those was someone consuming too much of an individual product. That led to very smart regulation, in my mind, that required us to take single pieces and divide them into doses. So we moved from, for example, at Dixie, we had a sunflower butter fudge that was 100 milligram single piece product, which sounds unheard of today because no one in any markets does that, right? But at the early stages of legalization, that product was a legitimate product. And we had to move away from it because we were required now to divide products in 10 milligram servings and no more than 10 per package. So that was really smart, I think, regulation that was part of our early days and really a significant move in the ability to destigmatize the plant, because I think that was everyone's big concern, was that there was just no one knew the strengths, no one knew how much to consume, and we had some situations that led to some problems, but we remedied those fairly quickly. The other thing that we realized very quickly was that we had very limited access to communication channels. And I was just talking about destigmatization and some of the changes we made in regulation, but we also knew that education was critically important, but our ability to communicate to consumers and to help with that education was fairly limited. And it's still limited, of course. As everybody knows, we don't have a ton of channels to market, but in particular in those early days, education was key. Start low, go slow was a campaign, for example, that a lot of us in the edibles industry kind of got together and developed so that we could put those in stores, into dispensaries, and they were then providing the information directly to the consumers, because we knew that for us as the edibles industry, it was important for the consumer to understand exactly how to consume these products, so we didn't have situations where people were consuming too much or weren't understanding how edibles work, because it was a novel and new product for most people. Most people had maybe a little bit of experience with their own homemade brownies, but actually, consuming consumer packaged goods that are dosed appropriately was new for many people. So getting education into people's hands, we had to go through the dispensaries. We had to band together as a subset of the industry. I remember sitting across the table from Wana on many occasions when I was with Dixie, working on some of these materials. So that was also a big effort towards destigmatization, because we knew that people were looking to us as marketers and as the industry to provide that information, much like you hear about with alcohol when there was that shift and alcohol began to be a little more responsible. So the drink responsibly on all of their information, and focusing on drunk driving programs and prevention and all that good stuff. The industry really wanted to be part of that and wanted to have those types of programs, but we were so nascent and we're so limited in what we could do and how we could communicate to the consumer that it was just a real challenge to get that information across. And we then, within that first year, began to move quickly into the realm of cannabis specific marketing channels. And so that was the onset of the early phases of technology. And by the way, I would say that we are in technology 3.0 at this point. So this was technology zero point 0.5 actually. We had some early platforms that identified we had issues in terms of channels that we could communicate through. So you began to see all of these social media platforms that were specific to cannabis. Massroots was the first, I think, well-known one, but they were early days, and they were leveraging technology that was made for the cannabis industry by the cannabis industry versus leveraging best practices or other platforms that had already been tried and worked well. And so we quickly learned that the cannabis consumer was a unique animal, and that these platforms really didn't provide, even though you would think logically, okay, if we create a platform for you to speak directly to the cannabis consumer about cannabis products, this is the best way to engage them because Facebook won't allow you to do so, or Instagram won't allow you to do so. So you would think that that would have been a great route for us to go. Unfortunately, the cannabis consumer didn't want to self-identify in many cases. The real potential for the market lay outside of those who maybe were on these social channels, showing big bong rips or smoking 5 joints at once. That's not what our brands and our companies were about in the early days of cannabis, and still are not, of course. I mean, I don't mean to say that it has changed, but that's not what we were about. And yet, all of these channels, that's all they seem to attract. So we were stuck still with an industry that didn't allow us to communicate in a responsible and mature way as companies, and yet these platforms were proliferating that were unfortunately providing the exact opposite effect that we wanted to have on the industry by trying to present a mature face to who we were as cannabis, and instead you had people dabbing, like I said, big bong rips, things like that. And that became the face of marketing for cannabis for a period of time. What we had in that first year of legalization, and this is, before other states started to get on board and before we had real momentum behind us as an industry, was we had brands who wanted to do the right thing but who were looking to stand out in the market. We had channels that were limited in terms of how we communicate, and we had so many things going on, from focusing on legislation and regulation that was still so critically important in the early days. Colorado, one of the great things that we did here was regulators and legislators recognized that industry needed to be a part of the discussions that they were having, so they began to convene work groups that allowed us to have a seat at the table in those regulatory discussions. Otherwise, frankly, the way that things went would have been much worse for this industry and would have caused a lot of significant heartache and challenges, because it was pretty much every 6 months there were new regulations where we had to stamp the product, we had to put it in different packaging, we couldn't use certain ingredients, and it seemed that every legislative session those were issues. And the reason why I bring that up is that as a marketer, that actually was critically important to what we were doing. Everything from, what kind of packaging can we use, to what ingredients will create the flavor profile that we're looking to create for this new upcoming product. Or in Dixie's case, would beverages be allowed? There was a period of time where I remember putting together, they were lobbying to eliminate what they called bulk beverages. So a 100 milligram bottle, which is what Dixie sold of their Dixie elixirs. And they'd gotten rid of bulk products in other categories. And I said, maybe what we need to do is show what will happen. So if you force us to put things into 10 milligram servings as beverages, you're going to end up with 10 packs of shooters. And I said, that will encourage, I think, even more sort of binge drinking as you're looking at as shooters versus looking at it as a bottle of alcohol, let's say, where you don't think to chug the whole bottle, but you do when you get it as a shot, right? So we put together, we mocked up a 10 pack of shots that they sell at the liquor store, and basically created that as the vision for this is where you're heading, right? So ultimately it didn't happen. And ultimately Dixie was able to keep their 100 milligram bottles. But my point is that would have completely changed the nature of the products that we sold and how we sold them. So as a marketer, it was really important that I got deeply involved in a lot of those regulatory discussions, because that was beginning to shape the most important aspects of who these companies were as brands, because it was dictating what products could they sell and what packaging, and through what channels. From there, we began to stabilize a little bit. More states came on board. More states looked at the Colorado model and said, okay, this is a decent model. And we still had, some churn. We still had changes in regulation, but companies began to come out of that and say, okay, we need to focus on lifestyle. And I think Wana and Dixie were two companies that really looked at that early on and said, okay, we are a lifestyle company. Let's look at imagery that is all about how we use this product in healthy ways out in the world. That this is, this was kind of phase two of destigmatization. Phase one being, let's develop a responsible and legal industry. Phase two is, let's show people that cannabis is a product that they can use regularly, and that, that lawyers use cannabis and athletes use cannabis, and really began showing people how it can integrate into their lives. And so that became a big push in the second and third year of legalization. So you'll see a lot of marketing from that time frame that moved towards, I'd say, more vivid colors, more people in the outdoors. We created partnerships with musicians, with events locally where we could. One of the big ones that I was really proud of at Dixie early on was the Underground Music Showcase. They were one of the first music festivals that allowed for cannabis marketing. So we had our tent set up, and by the way, it was nerve-wracking because we weren't quite sure if it met regulation or not, because we were in an outdoor environment, and we were not 100 feet away from the street, and there were all kinds of issues, right? But luckily, it ended up being okay. But my point there is that we had just a standard 10 by 10 tent, but it was the first time that we had a cannabis company at a music event like that, where anybody walking by could pick up information. That was another point of distribution for education, by the way, is that we did provide a lot of that educational material through these booths, but we had beach chairs, and we had music, and we made it into an environment that felt welcoming and also made it seem normalized. From there, we ended up going to the tacos and tequila event. That was our next kind of big visible event that we did. We took over the back cover of Dining Out magazine, which was in a number of hotels throughout the city. So we began to push more into that real mainstream consumer marketing at that point, because we had a baseline, we had a little bit of a push towards lifestyle imagery, and we had companies that were beginning to say, okay, cannabis is here to stay, and we are seeing that these brands are acting responsibly and maturely, and they don't have big pictures of joints and half naked women. And we almost went overboard trying to show that we were not that. And at times, in fact, with Dixie, and I think the case was true with Wana as well, marijuana leaves were verboten. We didn't have them anywhere on anything because we didn't want to show marijuana leaves, because we felt like that's just too in your face. And now eventually we pulled back from that and said, you know what, it's a marijuana plant. It is a plant. We should be able to show the leaf. So we did move away from that a little bit, but that's how strict we were early on about the image that we want to portray. In terms of going from those early days to where some of these brands are now, Wana in particular, there's a couple of things that have to happen in order for a cannabis company to be successful, because you've heard me outline all of the challenges, and those challenges still exist. I don't mean to say that, now that we're 7 years into it, that we still don't face all of these issues, but I think we've faced them enough times now that we know better how to handle them. Although a new curveball will come up seemingly every quarter, but nonetheless, I think we are a little bit further along. There's a number of things, though, that have to occur as a marketer, and whether you're the founder or whether you're serving in a marketing capacity for a company, I think the most important thing is buy-in from the executive team as to the importance of marketing. Because if the executive team is either too focused on numbers, they believe that cannabis sells itself. And I think a lot of people do get into this injury thinking, oh, well, it's cannabis. Everyone likes cannabis. It'll sell itself. it's a highly, highly competitive industry. So marketing has to be funded appropriately. So coming into it, everyone on the executive team, the CFO, the CEO, the COO, all have to say marketing is a priority. We'll approach marketing from the standpoint of making it a fundamental part of what we need to recognize as a business. I would say that's critical. That's point number one. And that it's not just a logo, right? So brand and marketing exists. I just mentioned like CFO, CEO, that exists. Marketing exists across the entire spectrum of the business. So you can have pretty packaging, you can have a nice logo, you can have a great tagline, but I guarantee you, if production doesn't hit the mark on that product and make a great product that is effective and is consistent, the consumer won't buy it. If the CFO doesn't pay bills on time and your vendors back out as a result, and you don't hold your brand promise of being a good company and good corporate citizens, you will fail. So brand has to really permeate the entirety of the corporation, of the industry, or sorry, of the business, in order for that brand to be successful. Because if any of those touch points fail, in my opinion, the brand as a whole fails. You also have to have what I would call an appetite for experimentation. This is an industry that's still forming. So I think some days, for those of us who've been in this business for a while, it feels like 100 years, but it's really only been 7. And as a result, not everything's been tried, right? And so we see, when I mentioned technology earlier, we see new and better technology coming across the plate every single day. And I take a lot of these calls. I get bombarded with requests for meetings and, let us present X, Y, and Z to you. And I don't take all of them, but I do take some of them, because inevitably I will find in talking to a new company that they have a new approach to a digital channel. They have a new approach to distribution. There's a new way to sell our products. Like, in last year, we implemented I Heart Jane on our website. That was, in my mind, one of the first edibles companies to actually have we'll call a pseudo e-commerce platform on their website. And many companies still don't have that as edibles companies. So those were technological developments that, if we had not experimented, we wouldn't necessarily have known whether they're successful or not. And many will fail, right? I go back to what I said earlier about getting that executive buy-in. My belief when I'm at Wana is that I will present ideas, and I will present those ideas with the very best intentions for success in mind. But I will always remind everyone on the exec team, this may not work. We're going to try it. Here's our tried and true. We know these things are working. We're going to try these 3 things, and we're going to see how they work, and we'll modify and go from there. If you don't have that appetite for experimentation, I would say you're probably in the wrong industry. And in fact, I think I heard Nancy talking earlier about that very same thing as it relates to kind of product in the business as a whole. You have got to have an appetite for experimentation, whether that's marketing, whether that's the product. I mean, that's what this industry is really founded on. And so it's really important to make that part of your marketing mix. Otherwise, you're going to get left behind, because I guarantee you, a year from now, the things I'm doing for Wana as a marketer are going to have changed and evolved, and there'll be newer and better and more interesting things for us to pursue in a year. And then lastly, understanding your differentiators and how to position those in the marketplace. This is an interesting industry in that you have such a volume of new businesses that come online, because, honestly, regulation drives a lot of that, right? As a new state comes on board, you get new brands and new products, and some states allow certain product types and don't allow other product types. And so you get this homegrown industry in every single market. And you also get a lot of Me Too companies, right? So gummies, we're in the gummy industry, and we're the #1 gummy manufacturer in North America. How many gummy products and companies are there? Dozens and dozens, and it varies by market. And so everyone looks at the market and says, well, gummies are where it's at, right? Everyone's buying gummies, so we're going to make a gummy. That's probably not going to achieve the success you're looking for, either as a marketer or as a company as a whole, because there isn't anything interesting or unique about your product to drive the consumer to switch from what they're currently using. So my advice is always to use the proverbial zig where they zag, right? So if everyone's in gummies, well, what's the category that's up and coming that people aren't looking at? That's something that we talk about all the time at Wana, is looking at the data and saying, okay, what are the little tiny like peaks that we're seeing that we need to be looking at from an R&D perspective, or how can we take an existing product like our gummy and innovate around it, right? So that we're not just putting out another gummy. And at the time we put out our first gummies, being vegan, being gluten-free, those were all really unique elements. Well, then, many other companies began to follow suit, and we've seen many of those in the market. So flavor was our differentiator. But then we added a layer of technology and innovation around the gummy, and we launched our quick line. And it has absolutely made an impact in the market and taken what was a category that was crowded and really allowed us to once again differentiate ourselves and stand out from the rest of the industry. So understanding your differentiators, understanding how to position those in the market against a very crowded, very frenetic, and very fractured marketplace is a really big challenge for marketers, but it's essential to success. So the regulatory environment is such that every state that legalizes has its own set of rules and regs, its own licenses. There is not interstate commerce, and as a result, you get two categories of products and brands in markets. You get the homegrown local market, and then you get companies and brands from other markets that try to enter into those markets. And Wana being one of those. So we're in 11 states in Canada currently. A few years ago, we were just in Colorado. So more and more companies are going to be looking to get into these new markets as they open up. New York, I think New York and New Jersey would probably be the biggest examples of states that I think many companies and brands are going to look to get into. But in every market that you go into, there is this homegrown element. So there's local brands that are favorites that when you move into that market, you have to understand the competitive set of that market, because our competitors in California are different than our competitors here in Colorado than they are in Arizona. So understanding the competitive set in the local market is critically important in order for you to achieve success on a national level, which is really where Wana is excelling currently. So as I mentioned, 11 states plus Canada, at a certain point, you achieve a critical mass. So now with 11 states, the person who tried you in Arizona that moved to California knows Wana and is bringing that over to their buying their purchase habits in California. Likewise, when we achieve success in Oregon and someone is visiting from, let's say, New York, they try a Wana product in Oregon, they love it, and they go back to New York. Well, when New York legalizes, they can't wait for Wana to come to New York because that's the product they know and love, and that's the opportunity we have right now as an industry, is to get to be first mover for the consumer, right? Because that's going to be the thing that they remember. I tried Wana in Oregon, or I tried Wana in Colorado. I loved it. It's a great product. That's the product I want to try when it comes to my state or my city. So we have this interesting balance of having to really compete fiercely locally against the entrenched players in those markets, but then really looking to leverage that presence nationally and putting some fuel behind that, right? So we're looking at national branding this year. This is the first year we really even talked about that as a business, is thinking about it as a national brand versus the state by state marketing we've done historically. And it's a really interesting opportunity. I'm excited to see what that does for us in the long term as it relates to, again, this knowledge share, this transfer of knowledge from consumer to consumer, from state to state. I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity for us and for any brand looking to build themselves. Do it right in one market, get it really dialed in, and then take it to the next and do the same. And then eventually you're going to get that critical mass where you do have a more national presence. And a big piece of that is creating strong and repeatable SOPs so that people understand not only the brand, but also that your products are consistent. That's been one of the biggest, I think, challenges for us, not as Wana, but really as an industry, is creating consistency across states because each of those regulations differ. And even as of today, my packaging, for example, in Florida is vastly different than it is in any other market because of the regulations there. But if I can make sure that our SOPs, and this is not me, this is operations, but as I mentioned earlier, it's all kind of one and the same when we talk about the brand. If I can make sure that operationally our SOPs are sound so that when we go into Florida, we're going to help them develop the exact same gummy that you have here in Colorado, then I know that when that consumer who loved us in Colorado tries us in Florida, we'll have the same experience. And that's how you build brand equity on the back of the product, because without that, you'll find that consumers, and I'm sure we've all experienced this with different products. I'm trying to think of a good example off the top of my head, but you have it in one market, it tastes one way, you try it elsewhere and it tastes different. And it never has that same first appeal that it had the first time you tried that product. We want to avoid that, and we do that by focusing on things like our terpene blends, having a consistent blend of 30 plus terpenes in our products that we have identified, that we create as our own custom blend, allows us to then have that consistent product across states, no matter the oil, because if we use distillate and we add those 30 terpenes, that's going to be the Wana product. Many companies don't recognize that, I think, and they think of each market as just being replicating their product, but humidity changes the product consistency. The oil will vary by market. Ensuring that you have really tight specs on that oil is critically important. So all of those pieces on the production side really do have to be there to support the brand when you move into a new market. And I think many companies have failed to do that, and that's why they don't take off in the second and third market, because they didn't really dial it in the first market. The only other thing I wanted to add also to this national brand thing is brand recognition in markets. I've never seen an industry that is so hungry for swag. I started out in this business thinking of swag as like, all right, we have some hats and t-shirts, we'll give them out for free. Swag is king. I mean, it's how you influence the budtenders. It's how you express your brand to the consumer. It is crossing between just a giveaway item to actually becoming lifestyle branded products that people covet and want in those markets. So I would really encourage anyone who's looking at a marketing strategy to double or triple whatever budget you think you're going to have for swag, double or triple it, because that's how much you're going to want or need in the market. And unfortunately, everyone's kind of doing that. So you're also competing with the latest and greatest from all 20 or 30 of the other companies you're competing with. So really focus on that swag and that development, and have a strategy around it. Make sure it matches your brand, make sure it is expressive of who you are as a company. As I was mentioning earlier, when we first started as an industry, there were very few channels that we had access to. Most advertisers didn't want cannabis. Social media certainly didn't want cannabis. I remember within the first 6 months at Dixie, we got kicked off of our Facebook presence, where we had thousands and thousands of followers, and social media became a real big issue. You had, as I mentioned, these cannabis-specific channels that began to pop up. You also had that for digital advertising. So Mantis Media was one of the earlier ones, but these cannabis platforms that would allow you to advertise to cannabis-safe publications. But unfortunately for me as a marketer, that created a very narrow window of people that I was talking to. I was really talking only to the core consumer, and that core consumer is someone who I consider to be someone who's very familiar with cannabis, someone who uses cannabis frequently. And that's a good person, right? Because that's the person who's buying the majority of my products. However, the bigger part of the pie overall is reaching someone who doesn't really understand cannabis, or isn't reading High Times, or isn't reading, MG Magazine or MJ Biz Daily. It's reaching someone who's reading People Magazine, who doesn't realize that cannabis maybe can help us sleep, or that cannabis is suddenly allowable and available in their market. So we had a dearth of those channels available to us. I would say over the last 3 years or so, that has really begun to change. And so now you'll see cannabis advertising on the digital side in platforms that I still get surprised. Like, I'll be reading a Newsweek article online or something, and all of a sudden I'll see a cannabis ad. I'm like, oh, that's interesting that that's there. And the reason for that change, I think, is that is twofold. One, it's the dropping of that sort of stigma that I think many people have with cannabis. So the advertisers are realizing there's money, people don't care as much. There's, favorite. I think legalization has a very favorable rating in this country. So those advertisers are beginning to say, okay, well, obviously people think it's okay, so we'll put it on our platform. But it's also because there were so many workarounds. And I think much like I'll create a parallel of digital music when MP3s became a thing. I'm that old, right? I remember when MP3s became a thing. The music industry was originally against it, right? We don't want MP3s. We're going to fight it. But it happened, right? And same with marketing and as it relates to cannabis, people found workarounds. We call it whack-a-mole. Like, oh, I figured out how to get onto Facebook advertising, and then they figured out and they'd slap it down, and they'd move around, and so eventually I think the advertisers just said, you know what, as long as it meets the regulations, we're going to allow these cannabis companies. And by and large, the good thing about the cannabis companies is that all of us, for the most part, want to be responsible advertisers. I don't want to advertise to kids. I don't want to create marketing that is going to appeal to an audience that I'm not trying to reach. And I don't want to create marketing that is exploitative in any way, shape, or form. We have an opportunity to really become an industry that is above all of that, and that actually sets an example and a tone for other industries. And it's something I'm actually really excited about and passionate about. We talk about a lot here at Wana is how do we push things forward, like equity, like environmentalism, like investment in our local communities. And we can do that through marketing channels. But my point in bringing all that up is we have this opportunity right now, and these marketers, the marketing channels are beginning to open up to us and allow us to express our brands in ways that I think are going to appeal to the new consumer, the younger consumer who understands the value of companies that walk the walk and talk the talk. We are also looking at changing regulations. So in Colorado, up until last year, we couldn't use out of home, which is billboards and anything that you don't consume in your house is considered out of home. We didn't have access to that previously. They changed the regulations and allowed us to begin advertising on billboards. Conversely, in California, they're having an opposite problem. So they did allow billboard advertising, and then so many cannabis companies found that to be a great way to break through in California that the regulators began to pull back. And some of the companies that sell those billboard spaces said, you know what, we've got enough cannabis advertisers, we're going to pull back on this right now. So there has to be a balance. I don't want to see cannabis everywhere, just like I get resentful and angry when I'm at the stadium with my kids and all I see is Budweiser and alcohol advertising all over the place. I don't think that's the right place for cannabis either. But having the access to those channels and doing it responsibly, I think we're going to see more and more of that as the market opens up. I like to give companies the benefit of the doubt. I think that most companies desire to do things the right way. And by that, I mean, I don't have to agree with how they position their brand. But, as I mentioned earlier, I also don't think that they're looking to market to kids or they're looking to add to the stigma of cannabis. I think most marketers in this industry are pretty responsible in that way. But there are companies that are doing it right and doing it well, and there's others that could use a little bit of work. And I think the examples. Of course, I am a little bit biased towards Wana. I think Wana. Before I got here, so this is not a credit to me or anything I've done, but Wana has done a really good job of creating a brand that is approachable and accessible and responsible. And one of the first things that Nancy tasked me with when I started as CMO here was, let's figure out why people like Wana as a brand. And we began to dissect that. What is the DNA of Wana? We had the pleasure and the privilege of creating a brand that organically lived in a way that people really felt connected to. And so we had to understand why, so that we could, of course, replicate that and get more people that like Wana. So as we began to peel those layers back, it was very clear that the reason why people love Wana was the fact that we were authentic and real in who we are and how we express ourselves and what we do in our communities. And so, I think that's been a really strong hallmark of our marketing. And I think most companies in the cannabis industry that are authentic and do things that are reflective of who they are as a company, and that also walk that walk, are doing pretty well. I think there are companies that are in and out in a flash. Those are the companies that you can easily identify by their packaging and by their products that looked at this industry and said, hey, I've got a real estate developer and a former investment banker. They're going to dump, 30 million dollars into our coffers. Let's go build a brand and get a product in the market. Those are the brands and the companies I don't think are doing it right. And I'll tell you why. They don't understand the plant. And that's the only I think edge that I would say brands are doing it right really have over other great marketers that maybe came from other industries, is an understanding of the plant and who the consumer is, how they use the product. This is not a replacement for alcohol. If I see, one more company talking about how they're going to replace beer with cannabis beer because that's the future, because people drink beer already. So if we just put cannabis in there, that's how we're gonna kind of overcome the declining volume in the alcohol industry. That's just not true. We've talked a lot about the changes and the evolution and all of these things that have happened in the industry over the last 7 years. But at the end of the day, what doesn't change is, as marketers, you got to figure out where to allocate your dollars, right? Because you've got to be able to express your brand and figure out how to influence the consumer purchasing decision. But what is interesting about where to spend those dollars in the cannabis industry is the influence that the stores have as a channel to reach the consumer in this industry versus pretty much any other CPG. So, when you go to the grocery store right now, you're not talking to the grocery store clerk about what soda to buy. You go to the store, you see Coca-Cola or Pepsi or whatever it is you like, and that's the product you buy. Or maybe you're on shelf and you see a new product you haven't seen before, or there's a shelf talker calling out a new flavor or something, and maybe try that, or there's a promo. All of that is normal consumer behavior. In this industry, the consumer is reliant in many cases on the bud tender. And not because the consumer doesn't have the ability to make their own choices or have their own opinion, but because the bud tender really holds the keys to education and to understanding the products that are in their store. So most consumers go into the store and say, what do you have for X, Y, or Z? And so you end up in a situation where the bud tender is influencing. I use the number about 80% of purchasing decisions in store. What was unique about this past year with COVID, however, was that we also began to see much more of a shift towards a digital footprint for the consumer who didn't want to go into the stores or who was purchasing their product ahead of time. So we certainly had this bifurcation of efforts on the part of brands. We had to still maintain our presence in the store and our education of bud tenders because they were still a critical resource. But that consumer was also potentially finding our products through digital channels. They log into their favorite dispensary's website and buy the product, or they look at brands and find aggregator sites like excuse me, like Three Wells or like Wana in California. These are aggregator sites that help to promote and bring visibility to certain brands. That's really why we actually partnered with iHeartJane. As I mentioned earlier, they're our sort of pseudo e-commerce platform on our site. Well, we partnered with them because we wanted to say to a consumer, oh, you're on our site, you're looking for our products. We can show you exactly where to buy them, what they're going to cost. You can reserve your product right here to really capture them in that digital funnel. And so that was an additional effort on the part of marketers over this past year. So back to the original point, where do you spend those dollars? Well, I would say swag, as I mentioned earlier, that's critically important. I would also add that in-store is really important as well. Wana right now is going through a process where we're completely renovating our in-store presence so that we have a greater shelf presence. The challenge there, just as an aside, is that every dispensary is different. There is no consistency. Some cases you have a shelf, some cases it's behind the bud tender, some cases it's in a glass jewel case. In California, products can be out on the counter. In all the rest of the markets, they can't. So there is no one size fits all approach to in-store point of sale or point of purchase displays. but they're critically important because that's what's going to catch the consumer's eye. So you'll see a lot of branding in stores. I think that's really important. I think PR is a channel that is also very important. It's not so much an investment channel from a money standpoint, although if you pay for an agency to help you, it can be a money, a financial drain. But PR has historically been, I think, one of the most effective and powerful channels. It's really how Dixie began to grow its presence early on, and it still is a big part of Wana's presence by having our name out in multitudes of different platforms. It's driving our SEO, it's driving consumer awareness, and it's allowing us to tap into things like thought leadership positioning, promotions that we can communicate through PR. So do not overlook PR, even though it's a little bit of what I would call like a traditional or old school type channel. Don't overlook that. It's really, really important. There are ways to communicate with bud tenders through platforms like Zoltrain. So this goes back to technology, but having a training platform for bud tenders so that you can train and educate them about your products, that's really important. And then I would say that even though we've spent a lot of time talking about our lack of traditional marketing channels, um, and I guess my feeling of I wish there were more of them. Really, they're not as hugely impactful to the overall mix of marketing that people should consider when you're talking about a cannabis brand, because um, it's good for top of funnel and awareness for getting to new consumers, but it's also not. If I was to line everything up, it's not as important as really reaching that bud tender and sending those bud tenders, speaking to the consumer in the store when they're there, having those that digital footprint, so we're capturing them in the digital journey that they're taking to find those products. Those are far more important in my mind. And then last, swag, swag, swag. Make sure you have swag in market, lots of gear. You got to show that brand. People like that, and that's how you create some level of allegiance. The other thing that's really important in the marketing mix is to have key partners, and that's everything from the retail channel to technology platforms. I like to go into markets and say that I have a technology stack. Like these are the companies I work with, because there is such churn and swirl in terms of, as I've mentioned a few times, regulation and other areas of this business that change on a regular basis. When you have good partners, people that you know how to work with, and that understand your brand, your product, that is a huge, huge lift. Having good partners is critical, whether that's marketing partners, whether that's tech partners, or whether that's retail partners. Identifying and really nourishing those partnerships and those relationships is really important. I think I personally have come across so many companies that don't understand the value of partners, that look at partners as vendors. As a marketer, I will tell you that having a Rolodex, that's a little bit of an old school term, but having a Rolodex of people that you can reach out to that are there for you and that are ready to jump into the mix in any given market or situation, really, really important. So I'd say identify your partners and really focus on them, and fuel those partnerships, give life to those partnerships, and look at them as more than just vendors.